I spent a week at a secluded cabin deep in the woods of Montana. It was about an hour from the nearest town, down an unmarked dirt road that twisted through miles of dense forest. Winter was settling in, leaving a thin layer of snow on the ground, but nothing too serious yet. The first few days were peaceful, quiet, serene, exactly what I needed. On the fourth night, just as the sun dipped below the tree line, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. There was no peephole, so I hesitated before cracking the door open just enough to see outside. A man stood on the porch, bundled in a thick winter coat, his breath fogging in the cold air. His face was gaunt, cheeks reddened from the chill, and his dark eyes seemed almost sunken. Snow clung to his shoulders like he had been outside for a long time. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said with a weak smile. "My car broke down a few miles back. Any chance you have a phone I could use?" I glanced past him into the trees. His story didn't make sense. There were no roads nearby that a car could have reached. The only way to this cabin was the dirt trail leading back to the main road, and I hadn't heard a single vehicle all day. "Sorry, no service out here," I lied. "Town's an hour that way." I pointed toward the road. The man didn't move. He just stood there for an uncomfortable moment, his breath slow and deliberate. "Well, thanks anyway," he finally said. But he didn't leave right away. He lingered just long enough to make my skin crawl before finally turning and walking into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I locked the door and tried to shake off the unease. Maybe he really was just lost. Maybe I was overthinking it. A few hours later, the snowfall had picked up, and I was starting to worry about the drive back at the end of the week. I pulled back the curtains at the back of the cabin to check the weather, and froze. There were footprints in the snow, leading from the woods, circling the cabin. A sinking feeling washed over me. The prints were fresh. I hadn't heard anyone walking around, but someone had been there. I quickly checked the locks on all the doors and windows before shutting off all the lights. I grabbed my phone, no service, of course. For the next hour, I sat in silence, listening for any sound outside. The wind howled against the windows, but nothing else. Just as I was beginning to think I was overreacting, a sound sent my stomach into knots. Knock, knock, knock. My breath caught in my throat. Knock, knock, knock. The same slow, deliberate rhythm as before. Then a voice, low, almost a whisper. "Hey, it's me again. Can I come in?" The man from earlier. I didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, waiting, hoping he would just leave. But instead of more knocking, there was a long, agonizing silence. I reached for my flashlight, trying to steady my breathing. Then, thud. The sound came from above me. The roof. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. Someone was moving up there. Slow, deliberate footsteps creaked against the wooden shingles. He wasn't at the door anymore. He was on the cabin. I had to do something. I grabbed my car keys and, as quietly as possible, crept toward the front door. If I could make it to my truck, I could drive to town. My hand was inches from the handle when something heavy slammed against the roof, shaking the entire cabin. I froze. Silence. Then, a slow, scraping sound, like nails dragging across the wooden roof, inching toward the edge, toward the door. I turned the knob and bolted outside into the snow, slipping as I ran for my truck. I yanked open the door, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine just as something hit the hood. Hard. It was him. His face was inches from mine through the windshield, mouth twisted into a sick grin. His hand slammed against the glass. I threw the truck into reverse, tires skidding on the icy ground. The man lost his balance and fell away into the snow as I floored it down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached town. When I told the local sheriff what happened, he barely reacted, just nodded and took a slow sip of his coffee. "You're lucky," he finally said. "Last winter, another guy rented that cabin, never made it back." I didn't stay to ask for details. I just got in my truck and kept driving. I don't think I'll ever go back to that cabin, and I sure as hell will never answer a knock on the door in the middle of the night again. I never used to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, urban legends, they were just that, stories. But what happened to me last winter changed everything. I had taken a seasonal job as a caretaker for an off-season campground deep in the woods of North Dakota. The place was miles away from the nearest town, completely isolated and buried under thick layers of snow. My job was simple: check on the empty cabins, make sure no squatters had moved in, and report any damages to management. I welcomed the solitude, thinking it would be a peaceful way to spend a few months. For the first week, everything was fine. Peaceful, even. The snowfall was steady, the air crisp, and I spent most of my time reading or listening to music by the fireplace. But on the 8th night, something changed. It started with a phone call. The landline in the main office rang around midnight. There was no caller ID, but I assumed it was management checking in. I picked up. At first, there was only static, then a whisper. It was low, raspy, and constant. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't background noise. Someone was whispering directly into the phone. "Hello," I said. The whispering continued, a steady stream of unintelligible murmurs. The voice was deep, almost guttural, and the more I listened, the more uneasy I felt. I hung up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a bad connection, maybe the wind messing with the lines. But an hour later, the phone rang again. I hesitated before picking up, again the whispering. This time it was closer. I could hear every breath, every unnatural syllable. It wasn't a language I recognized. The way the words slithered into my ear made my skin crawl. Then the whispering stopped, and there was a knock at the door. I froze. I hadn't heard any footsteps approaching. No crunching snow, no sign that someone had come up the long, icy path leading to the cabin. Another knock. Slow, rhythmic. I turned off the lights. My heart pounded in my chest. The only way someone could have reached me was by foot. There were no tire tracks, no vehicles. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive through the snow. I edged toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I peeked through the curtain. There was no one there. But then I noticed something even more disturbing. There were no footprints in the fresh snow outside the door. Another knock. I backed away from the window, grabbing the hunting rifle I kept under the couch. I wasn't going to take any chances. And then, thud, a heavy impact on the roof. Something or someone had just landed above me. I stood frozen, my grip tightening on the rifle. The cabin was small, and the roof was covered in snow, but the sound had been unmistakable. A deep, dragging noise followed, like something heavy being pulled across the roof. Then, silence. I stayed there for what felt like hours, barely breathing. I didn't dare go outside, not with whatever was out there. I didn't even move until the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees. When I finally got the courage to step outside, my stomach twisted. There were no footprints around the cabin, no signs of anything or anyone having been there at all. But on the roof, the snow had been disturbed, long, deep trails, as if something had crawled across it on all fours. That was the last night I spent in that cabin. I packed my things and left as soon as the next caretaker arrived. I didn't tell him what had happened. Who would believe me? A month later, I got a text from him. "Hey, have you ever gotten weird phone calls on that landline? I keep hearing something, whispering." I blocked the number and never looked back. I grew up in Montana, so I know the wilderness. I know the way the snow deadens sound, how the trees can make you feel like you're being watched even when you're alone, and how the cold can turn deadly if you're not careful. But nothing prepared me for that night. Last December, I took a solo trip to my family's old hunting cabin deep in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a tradition, 1 week alone in the wilderness, just me, my rifle, and the silence. It was supposed to be peaceful. The first few nights were uneventful. The days were short, the nights long, and the wind howled through the trees like a distant scream. But on the 5th night, I woke up to something strange. The front door was open, just slightly, maybe an inch or two, but open enough for the cold to seep inside. I sat up in bed, my breath visible in the freezing air. My first thought was that I had forgotten to latch it properly, but I knew I hadn't. I always locked it. The snow outside was untouched, no footprints, no tracks. I closed the door, locked it again, and pushed a chair against it, just to be sure. Then I went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. I woke up colder than usual. my blanket pulled halfway off me. When I looked toward the door, it was open, again just a crack, but open. My stomach twisted. I checked outside. Still no tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. But this time, something was different. In the fresh snow just outside the door, there was one single handprint. It was elongated, the fingers too long, the palm too narrow. It looked human, but wrong. I shut the door and bolted it. I barely slept that night, rifle in hand, waiting for the sound of footsteps. But nothing came. The next morning, I checked the cabin carefully. Everything seemed normal, no signs of forced entry, no damage. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cabin key was sitting on the kitchen table. I always kept it in my pocket, always. And yet, somehow, it was there. I packed my things. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I must have forgotten the key, that the handprint was just a trick of the light. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been inside the cabin with me. As I loaded my truck, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I turned back to the tree line, and that's when I saw him. A figure, half hidden behind a tree, not moving, not breathing, just watching. His body was covered in a thin layer of snow, like he had been standing there for hours. His face was pale, almost blue, and his lips were stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. I blinked, and he was gone. I didn't stay to find out where he went. I drove out of those mountains faster than I ever had before. The snow-covered road be damned. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know how the door kept opening. I don't know how the key ended up on the table. But I do know one thing. Something else was out there with me, and it wanted me to know it. When I was 10, my grandfather told me never to leave my bedroom window unlocked at night. It's not about burglars, he had said, his face unusually serious. It's about him. When I asked who he was, Grandpa just shook his head. Just keep it locked. And if you hear scratching, don't look. At the time, I thought it was just another old man's superstition. But now, years later, I know he was trying to protect me. And I wish I had listened. The first night, I was house-sitting my grandparents' old place in rural Vermont, deep in the woods where the nearest neighbor was miles away. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind where the wind howled through the trees, making the whole house creak. I had just settled into my childhood bedroom when I noticed something. The window was unlocked. I frowned. I was sure I had locked it earlier. Maybe I had just forgotten. Either way, I clicked the latch shut and got into bed. That was the first night I heard the scratching. It started as a faint, rhythmic sound, like tree branches tapping against the glass. But as I listened, it became more deliberate, more like nails, long, scraping drags against the window pane. I lay frozen in bed, my grandfather's words echoing in my mind. If you hear scratching, don't look. The sound continued for what felt like hours, but I refused to move. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The second night. The next morning, I checked the window from the outside. There were marks on the glass, not cracks, not smudges, scratches, deep, deliberate grooves like something had been clawing at it. My stomach twisted. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a raccoon, maybe wind-blown debris, but deep down, I knew. That night, I locked the window, double-checked it, made sure it was sealed tight. But at exactly midnight, the scratching returned. And this time, it was louder. It wasn't random anymore. It had a rhythm like something tapping in a pattern scrape. Scrape, scrape, tap, scrape, 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 tap. I pulled the blankets over my head, heart pounding, if you look. Then something whispered my name, not from outside, from inside the room. I bolted upright, my breath frozen in my throat. The scratching had stopped. The room was dead silent. But in the darkness, I saw it, a shadow in the corner, tall, unmoving, watching. I shut my eyes and willed it to be a dream. When I opened them again, the shadow was gone. The third night, I should have left. I should have packed my things and never returned. But I needed to know. That night, I stayed up with a flashlight, sitting in bed facing the window. I wanted to see it, to prove to myself that it wasn't real. At exactly midnight, the scratching began again. This time I looked, and I wished to God I hadn't. A face was staring at me through the glass. Pale, hollow eyes, a mouth stretched too wide, grinning. But the worst part, It wasn't outside. It was inside the room. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. All I remember is waking up the next morning, lying in the middle of the living room, the front door wide open, snow covering the floor. I never stayed in that house again, but sometimes late at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the scratching.